Welcome to the Neutral Ground podcast. This week, my guest is Matt Munroe of the Quotations podcast, which can be found on your usual podcast platforms. Matt and I share a love of language, specifically of meaningful language that speaks to the human experience. In this episode, we talk about why it's important to return to great works, to read or listen to them again, how to impose some order on the madness of the world, and we even discuss a little bit of our favorite quotations from television, things like Game of Thrones and even Suits. Now, come to think of it, our episode is pretty eclectic, but it's packed full of really great thoughts for you to chew on. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Matt Munroe. Matt, let me say welcome to the Neutral Ground. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. So let's jump into this a little bit here, right? Because at the beginning of every episode of your Quotations podcast, you say, this is a podcast about words written and spoken throughout history. So what is it about that connection between language and history that prompted you to want to create a podcast on the subject?
Sure. That's a great question. Thanks, Joe. I think there are two pieces. So the physical origin of how I started capturing and recording quotes goes back to when I was in college. I was in my undergrad program, and I was at Maine Maritime Academy, which is a small school in coastal Maine. And I had a mentor there, Randy Grimm. He's actually a retired Marine himself. And he had a book very similar to what I have, which is just a place to capture little pieces of knowledge, little nuggets as you kind of go through your day and through your life. And I saw that, and it was kind of an inspiration to me, and I started doing the same thing. So I've been at it now for close to a decade and a half of collecting that, and it's yielded quite a collection of quotes. And I thought to myself, well, these are valuable to me. Clearly they mean something to me, and I would hope that they would mean something to others. So that's what kind of prompted me physically to go down that path. But as I thought about it, and I went beyond the mechanics of I need a microphone, I have a book of quotes, I need to talk about those quotes, and went into why does this matter? I started to kind of picture, and again, Maine Maritime Academy, a lot about boats and shipping and things like that. And the reason that I latched onto that phrase, words written and spoken throughout history, is much like a ship when it ties up to a dock. It's not a single line that ties that ship to a dock. The larger the ship, the more lines there are, and they go in all directions. You see them coming off the bow of the ship and the stern of the ship, and they hold that boat, which is a free-floating thing, firm to something, in this case, the dock itself. And so the image that pops into my mind when I think about myself is almost as that ship, kind of free-floating through life, kind of going along, and those lines tie me to something firm, and they reach forward into the future and guide me in a specific direction. They reach into the past, and they draw on the knowledge and the experiences, the hardships and the successes of others. And in that way, I think words act as almost an anchor of sorts to the better and potentially also the worst parts of us. We've tackled some challenging episodes with some challenging characters, people who had difficult pasts, people who had some ideas that today we might find outdated or incorrect. But I think contextually, the idea of throwing out someone just because their words or their life wasn't perfect is an error. And so for me, it's a way to stay connected and to glean from the experiences of others, things that can be valuable to me today.
Yeah. Do you ever, because obviously none of us are perfect. You could always take a transcript of any of us and find problematic, things, but sometimes we're just grappling. We're trying to figure out what's going on there. I'm curious, do you ever go back over a particular quotation or words or sentiment and find that meaning for you has changed significantly over time?
Yeah, absolutely I do. I think one of my traditions that I've kind of taken to is my book, which I said, I'd be hazarding a guess here to say it's probably got close to 1,000 quotes in it at this point that I've collected over the years. each year at the beginning of the year or near the beginning of the year, I like to go through and reread the entire book, beginning to end. And every time I do that, something jumps out to me. And I think that it's usually something new, something that I've certainly read before, but for some reason it has a new and more profound meaning at that time. And I think that speaks to the old quote, a man never crosses the same river twice because the river is never the same and the man is never the same. And it's the same thing is when I go back to that book, again, that anchor, and I reread those words that are captured there, I'm not the same person I was a year ago. The world in which I live is not the same as it was a year ago. Instead, while those words have remained constant, their meaning and the things that I can derive from them have changed based on my circumstances. So absolutely, that happens all the time. Things that a lot of the quotes early on in the book are from, an early time, my formative time as a Marine Corps officer. And so they're centered around Marine Corps style leadership. And there are certain things in there that haven't made their way onto the podcast yet. And I don't know that they ever will because they're so specific to that particular point in my development as an individual that I don't know that they'd have the same applicability. I don't know if some of the things that motivate a Marine officer to be the best leader he can be are always 100% applicable to the world at large. But there have been times where I have gone back to something that I thought was not necessarily applicable in that way and gone, there's something new here. There's something valuable here that I overlooked before or I dismissed out of hand because I didn't think it was applicable. But it turns out, given the circumstances of the day or some anecdote that has happened that I can relate to now that I couldn't before, does tie this to something that would be valuable to folks. So yeah, that happens quite often.
Yeah, now I'm just from my own example too, I often encourage people to reread things as well, because I know for a lot of people, reading is kind of a one-time journey, because not that we use it as like a list of what we did and didn't read, but for example, I mean, I've read as just a part of my job as a lecturer in college. I've read and reread, the Odyssey, let's say by Homer, quite a few times, and I've never ever came away from it with the same, ideas. More specifically, just recently, my last reread about a year or so ago now, I came across a character that I never paid attention to before, named Elpinor. And of course, everyone knows the epic story of Elpinor.
Of course.
And of course, right? And the funny thing about Elpinor, though, is Odysseus finds him in the underworld, and Elpinor was one of his men on the ship, and he passed away. And Elpinor essentially got drunk, fell off of, I think, a roof, and broke his neck. And here is Elpinor in the underworld, and he's telling Odysseus, listen, you have to go back and bury my body. Because, of course, in the ancient Greek tradition, an unburied body becomes a kind of wandering shade. It's a pretty horrible kind of afterlife here. But what was always kind of a throwaway move past story, the story of Elpinor really kind of stuck with me this time. And it made me think about how we tend to put ourselves as the hero of our own stories. But of course, there are other people in our tales. And we don't often think of the Elpinors in our stories sometimes. And it's something for us to always kind of challenge ourselves to think about, is how people are even left when they leave our stories. Did we leave them with the best version of ourselves that we possibly could in some ways? And so I absolutely, like you, I encourage people to not simply read, but reread. And this kind of maybe brings us into the next kind of question I have here. I'm curious about another thread that I found in your podcast. That thread being an appreciation for order and discipline. And I'm wondering, what's the connection there between kind of the language, order, and discipline as you see it?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm glad that you picked up on that, because it's not something that I even necessarily know how that became a thread. It's interesting,
Sure.
in the podcast evolution, how you find your voice and kind of find the
Hmm.
rhythm of things. And you're right, that has emerged. And when I go back, when I have the time and listen to older episodes, which is a challenging thing to do as you get deeper into it, you go
Yes.
back and listen with horror at some of the things that
Yes.
the early days, as it were. But you're right. There is a certain amount of order and discipline that I think comes from that, and there's a self improvement piece that is tucked into almost every episode because those words clearly stood out. I used to call it my leadership quote book because it was designed to kind of enhance my leadership. It was lessons learned and words captured from people who I admired or at least felt challenged by as a leader. So the idea there, I guess you could, the rudimentary way to look at it would be, well, it clearly traces back to the fact that, Marines and people in the military in general tend to be fairly ordered and fairly disciplined. So that must be why. But what I really think it is more so for me is that life is a challenge. From the moment we wake up, we're inundated with information. We are forced to make decisions. I had a guest on recently that referenced and said the average person makes 35,000 decisions in a day. Some of them are significant, some of them are relatively insignificant. But that's a lot of a requirement on a person, on the mental capacity of a person. And life is hard. And then you mix in all the challenges of, spouses and children and coworkers and friends and family that you have to interact with. And you have to navigate all of those things. And it can feel very disordered as a result of that. It can feel very chaotic. And it's the type of thing that has, causes people to need to talk to someone, to have, whether it be a therapist or a close friend or something, to try to sort out the madness. And I think when you hear words, especially historical words, when we look back at Mark Twain and Benjamin Franklin and other historical figures throughout time, and you get the richness of the context from the words that they said, because you understand, at least what I hope to do is to deliver the context of those words so that people understand that the founding fathers or the Homers of the world, as far back as you can go, their lives were complicated too. They were people that were challenged. And yet, in the midst of all of that difficulty and challenge and disorder and seeming chaos, emerges these iconic phrases that drift through time, perpetuated and handed off generation to generation, and then land in my lap, and then land on the podcast, and land in somebody else's ears. And to me, it shows the humanity of these great enlightened thinkers whose names a lot of times you only see attached to a colorful background with colorful words, that little, the dash, and then that person's name. And you think, this person had it figured out. This person got it. But what you don't realize is that chaos and disorder and challenge have existed since time immemorial. And they sorted through it the way that we are. So in drawing from their words, I think it helps me find a certain sense of that order and discipline that you referenced.
Yeah, you're speaking my language here, Matt. Absolutely, because one thing that we're always trying to do is impose order on the chaos of our minds, right? And we can do that through a couple of means, right? Some of you even mention in your own podcast as well, through those virtues that you brought up of Benjamin Franklin, which we'll get to in a minute. But I encourage people, we've been doing this for thousands of years as a species. We do have journals and diaries and even just writing creatively, poetry or prose, whatever it is. There is something about the writing process that forces us to impose order on the chaos of a situation. And of course, our memories are not, the research has basically been out now for quite a while, that our memories are not all that reliable. However, what is useful about talking and useful about writing about these situations is you are still forcing your mind to try to create some kind of clarity of narrative, which is really important for us moving forward, especially trying to move past difficult things, is to try to find clarity and impose that order on the chaos of what's happening. And I think you have a great point there with that connection. This segues nicely into this wonderful, and as an early Americanist, I appreciate it, this wonderful 3-part series that you have here on one of the grandest forefathers of all of the United States of America. And you know what? You taught me something that I didn't know about Franklin, which was I did not know that he was the only person to sign the Declaration, Constitution, and the Treaty of Paris. That's a fantastic little bit of knowledge. I did not know that. But it makes sense, of course, given his history with Paris, his relations and whatnot. And they loved him over there for various reasons. A bit of a hedonist over there, and they appreciated that in him, honestly. But in your deep dive into Franklin, what did you learn from it? Or what did you learn about him, and what did you maybe take away from it?
Yeah, I think I wrote those virtues down years ago. I mean, I can kind of, and I've bemoaned this a number of times that I didn't do as good a job of capturing where a quote came from or at what time in my life, but I can kind of trace the trajectory because I know when I started. So I know that I took down those Franklin virtues years ago, probably in the 2010, 2011 time period. And I think at the time, they stood out to me because lists are nice, right? Lists distill the chaos down that we were just talking about into something that's manageable. You talk about, and if you look at my podcast feed, you'll see there's a number of things that revolve around lists. There's Rappaport's 4 rules, there's Franklin's 13 virtues, and on and on and on. And I think that helps with some of that. So I think the most interesting piece to me from that was the fact that Franklin himself, when he wrote these, I assumed he was a 50, 60-year-old man when he wrote these virtues. Like, this is the culmination of a life's work. And what I found was that, Franklin was 20 years old when he wrote that. And that's astonishing to me when I think back to where I was in my capacity at 20 years old. And I was in the pipeline to become a Marine Corps officer. And so more attuned, I would say, to the characteristics that I was presenting than some other 20-year-olds maybe. And that's not self-aggrandizement necessarily, just it's a recognition that that's an expectation of that process, is self-examination. But for Franklin to be on a journey coming back from Europe, sitting on a boat, doing the self-analysis and then distilling down his self-analysis, which people spend lifetimes trying to do on their own, into these 13 virtues that he would then spend the rest of his life trying and failing in a lot of ways to pursue diligently, was fascinating to me. And I said to myself, well, if Benjamin Franklin, amidst all the other things that he did, between being, a governor and being an envoy to foreign nations and signing all of these documents and sitting in these great debates to reach conclusions of these documents, if he could find the time to devote to these 13 virtues, even if he imperfectly fulfilled them, that is, to me, a challenge of value. And again, in the vein of self-improvement, taking those 13 virtues, and in the final episode of that series, I tell people, it doesn't necessarily matter if you agree or disagree with those 13 virtues at all. But do you have your own? Do you have some guiding principles? There's a cheesy book that I read back in the day. I shouldn't say cheesy. There was value to it. It just had a cheesy title. It was called Hold On to Your Nuts. And it was written by a man for men. And NUTS was an acronym which stood for non-negotiable, unalterable terms. And the idea being, do the self-examination, and the book was a guide of do the self-examination, identify the things that are important to you as a person, or as a man in this case, but you could extend it beyond just the male gender. Identify what those things are, and then codify them, write them down, make them yours, and then adhere to them. And I think that's an interesting thread that passes through time, and you can see that in many of the great speakers, going all the way back to Franklin and even beyond that, but all the way through time. There are common themes that anybody that spoke or wrote in any significant quantity had, that you can tease out of that. You can tease out the themes in Mark Twain's writing. You can tease out the themes in Martin Luther King's speeches. And you can see that those people, whether they actually had them written down or not, had certain principles that they adhered to, deliberately or not, and they guided them. So there was a lesson there for myself and also for the listeners, I think, in that.
Yeah, and actually, it's funny, you just reminded me too that, and I'd have to go back and look this up exactly when, but Washington as well, George Washington, also codified a list of virtues as well when he was young. when he was very young. And people still look to that list and try to see, by the end of his life, how much of those kind of stood. And of course, quite a few of them did. More than anything, Washington was, I think Jefferson, upon the death of Washington, he said that, and they weren't exactly on the greatest terms at the tail end, but nonetheless, Jefferson still said prudence was the greatest virtue for Washington in the end, his ability to sort of wait and then take in the information of a situation and then make the best possible call based on what was necessary, but that patience and not overreacting. And of course, that always stood out to me, was that idea that what Jefferson saw as greatness in Washington. So you can tease out and pull out quite a bit of information from just reading in general, everything, that we can consume. I think this probably also is a good way in then. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you sort of talk about, well, what I love is you challenge your listeners to not simply read or consume, but to read and or consume purposefully. Can you talk a little bit about that distinction there?
Yeah, absolutely. That challenge, and the funny part is, and I try to make this clear to the listeners, is my podcast is not intended to be directive. It's not intended to be that, barking orders at people. People are choosing to listen from amongst the million other podcasts. They're choosing to sit and listen to mine. And my goal there is not to be directive, but to encourage people to take something from it beyond when the outro plays. To have the podcast carry on from there. And one of those things is the deliberate reading piece. And for me, the physical manifestation of that is the quote book for me. It has altered fundamentally the way that I approach anything that I listen to or read. There is no skimming anymore. There is no just kind of listening to something in the background anymore for me. It has taken my attention up a level, because I'm always looking for or listening for those words. And they come from some of the strangest places. Random conversations overheard on a street corner have yielded things that have ended up in the book. Reading some of the classic pieces of literature have ended up in the book. Watching shows on television has yielded quotes that have ended up in the book. And I think the only way to achieve that is to be deliberate. I don't think you accidentally, and this isn't an original thought, you don't accident into success. There is something at some point along the way where you set the conditions that yield success or can yield success. And so if my goal is to improve myself, to present a quality product to my listeners, to improve my listeners' lives in some small way, I have to be deliberate about that. And so it stands to reason in my mind then that if that is the method by which I succeed, is by being deliberate and being conscious of what's coming into my eyes and into my ears, that encouraging the listeners to do the same is one of the best ways to do that, to analyze the world around us, to take in that chaos and sift through it. And it's exhausting. There are days that I think it happens to all of us where we go to bed exhausted. You're mentally drained and you need that reset. And there's biological reasons that happens as well. But just from I distinctly remember in college spending time on some difficult math or engineering problems and feeling drained at the end of it. You get the end of a difficult problem set. Life is a problem set, and we have to work through it. And the result is that it is draining. But if we are able to devote that focus rather than spend it on trivial things, and that's not a value judgment. It's if you want to improve, there are things that are worth your time and valuable and things that are not. And so rather than spending our time on trivial things, going back to that order and discipline piece, is you control your attentions. You can choose to, but sometimes we need to be reminded of that, because sometimes it feels like we're just being led throughout the day from one thing to the next. And that is, in a lot of ways, the business model of various entities, is to guide you from one thing to the next to keep your attentions. But if you can control that and you can focus and you can read deliberately, to sit down with a book and really spend time with it, and chew on things. And you actually said something in an episode that I listened to. I think it was your modernism episode where you were talking about, you referenced active listening and the idea that it is okay to pause the podcast. It's okay to stop as you're going through something and think about it. Because what better time than right then? Because you're going to forget it. It happens to me all the time. I have to rewind 5, 6, 7 minutes in a podcast to go back and find something that I now makes sense. But pausing and actively listening and deliberately reading are very similar things, because you're trying to get and tease as much valuable information out of that as you possibly can. So a rambling answer to your question, but certainly.
No, not at all. It was great. It was a great answer. And you made me think of something that I discussed with my students even this past semester. We were talking about the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and I was going over a section in the autobiography where he learns how to read and write. He talks about the process, and the deliberate method. So he has a text that he refers to called the Columbian Order. And in the Columbian Order, if you ever look at the text, it's just a whole myriad of different types of stories and whatnot. And what he does there is he reads through it and pulls what he needs, pulls the inspiration that he needs in order to make the case for why, not simply himself, but why others should be free as well, why the slaves should be completely free. But I sort of in one of my classes, I kind of just stopped in the middle of myself, talking with them. And I just started posing questions about my own thoughts to the students. And part of the reason why I did that is because I wanted their help to make sense of what was going on as well. And we don't often think about doing that when we're speaking, is to kind of pause ourselves, even have an active listening moment to ourselves. It's why I'm very big on the idea of giving a thought your own language so that you can maximize its understanding. And then at some point, you've got to see how it manifests in the world, right? Where does it show itself? But then when you start formulating your own idea of how it works, you've got to say it out loud, even if it's just to an empty room. And I do mean that. I mean empty room, even if it's that. Better if you have someone there, of course, but still, there's something about that process of hearing it out loud that gives it a different kind of sense or a different meaning almost. You're going to pick up on things that don't quite add up. And I think that's sort of what happened to me there in the classroom. Was I had said something and I thought, wait, that didn't quite sound right. Let's work through it together. But we did that as an exercise of, again, kind of imposing order on the chaos of what I had said of that moment. And it's fascinating to think that here's a man who is struggling to just learn how to read. And we talk a lot today about how knowledge is power, right? That's a big phrase. But that's one of the phrases that we actually dissected in the class is, what does that actually mean? And what's the essential word in that phrase? Because the phrase is almost an equation. You're saying knowledge equates to power. And then in order to make sense of what that means, you have to be able to define what power is as well. So we talked about power as a kind of way of access to language, access to these abilities to continually grow, right? As you mentioned. And now I'm the one, I think, I might be rambling here, but that's because I'm kind of doing what I said. I'm saying it out loud so that we can kind of make sense and grapple with it together. But yeah, I found that idea of reading purposefully, that challenge, which I think is an incredibly important challenge today because we consume so much content. I mean, we're consuming each other's content, we're consuming other content, whether it's just a TV show. And I just found out that a quote that I had liked came from a TV show that I hadn't watched. I didn't watch Game of Thrones, so I have no real knowledge of what happens. I know people love it, but I came across that quotation about, when you pull out or cut out a man's tongue, you don't prove him a liar, you prove to be afraid of what he has to say, something like that. And I had said that quote to somebody because I thought it's a really interesting quote. And they said, oh yeah, that's from Game of Thrones. And I thought, wow, you really can, if you listen with intention, you really can pull out important things that you can use in your life to continually engage meaning, continually engage bettering yourself and bettering your relationship with others around you as well. And I found that thread in your podcast to be so important. And I was very grateful to even hear it, that idea of don't just consume, consume with purpose.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's funny. It's funny you mentioned that because the quote from Game of Thrones, because it takes me back to a show that it did an episode many episodes ago by a character in the show Suits, which is about lawyers in New York City, and they are classic drama of a law firm and things like that. But there is a fantastic quote, and it's in the middle of one of the episodes, and it's about 5 seconds long, and the character says, "It never hurts to get a second opinion on the way you treat people." And you could very easily gloss over that as just part of the script. You can dismiss things offhand because it's a comedy movie or it's a TV show or it's some writer sitting in a back room. What possible value could it have? And I think that's the important piece that you touch on there is those words meant something to you. And clearly they're important enough that amid all of the other things, I mean, I see the library of books behind you and all of the things that you consume as a professor and things that you put out and papers that you grade and all of the content, those words stuck with you. They almost float out of whatever medium you originally consumed them from and stuck with you. So it doesn't matter. And that's something I've tried to impress upon listeners as well, is it doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter if it was your grandmother's dying word or something that a small child said on a playground one day. What matters is that it stood out to you. And more importantly, to what we're talking about here is the fact that you were attuned enough to that medium, whether it was a child on the playground, the dying words of your grandmother, the words on a page from Charles Dickens, doesn't matter. What matters is that you were attuned enough to it to capture it. Right? Because that is a learned skill. And not to get all fatalistic and existential and things like that, but there is so much competing for our attention today. Mm-hmm. The idea of, I mean, you can go and listen to people talk about the need to be bored because we're so removed from being bored. And you think about just the trajectory over time of words consumed in a day or words consumed in a year compared to 200-300 years ago, where written medium wasn't as readily available as it is today. Certainly there was no internet, books were more scarce, and people were the only medium that they had was conversation. Well, then you add in the advent of modern technologies like the radio and television and the telegraph and telephones, and then you add on top of that the internet, and you think about how much content we consume on a daily basis. Just sitting here talking to you, there are probably 50 words right in front of my face on the screen, and most of them are meaningless. So, but if we can teach ourselves to be attuned to where we're at and to recognize that valuable content can come from any medium, then we can learn to parse out those pieces, to see those pieces, to almost have them jump off the page or off the screen, so that we can consume them and internalize them and use them for good.
Yeah, and this actually connects back a little bit too to Franklin to a degree. You're making me think of how technology has in some ways altered our definition of leisure, right? Because
Absolutely.
What I'm questioning now in listening to you is, even for myself, how do I define leisure time, right? Because we take it for granted that there's a certain switch, especially in Western culture around the Enlightenment, around modernity, where in some ways you can say that we're able to enter into the Enlightenment because of the advances that we didn't have maybe as much to think about in terms of mortality, food, right? Access to water, medicine. We make great leaps in medicine as well in the Enlightenment period. And that is one spot where it introduces a kind of new leisure. And that leisure time allows for the ability to sit down and read and think and all of that, right? We take that for granted. But now when you move into the 20th century and you have these other mediums like radio, television, and then you move into the late 20th, early 21st century, we've got the internet, we've got, YouTube, podcasts, all these different things. I'm curious if I define leisure time as, Netflix time, turn my mind off time, whereas leisure time in other periods sort of meant consuming things that could also challenge you in some ways. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. It's too easy, I think, today to default to a moment of silence, a moment of inactivity needing to be filled. And there are various writers and speakers that have spoken about, that pause, again, kind of that boredom, being okay with being still. I'm reading an interesting book right now called One Square Inch of Silence. And the book is fascinating because it is a man's attempt to identify some of the vanishingly few and maintain those few locations within the United States where you can really achieve uninterrupted silence. And not natural silence. Obviously, there'll be birds, there'll be wind, but no man-made interference. And that's a fascinating pursuit to me. It's always fascinating what people find to devote their lives to, the directions that people go, and how you end up as a soundscape artist, and latching onto this idea of vanishing silence and pursuing that. And it creates a magnetic effect for me anyway, when I hear people talk with passion about what they're interested in. And the idea of pursuing that true silence, even just reading that book deliberately, I would say, I found myself, I was hiking this last weekend and found myself pausing on the trail to just listen and say, maybe I've found 1 square inch of silence. Maybe it's silent here for just a moment. And then off in the distance, you hear the traffic on the road and you go, not here, right? But that it's okay to pursue those things. It's okay to not say, I'm not doing something right this moment. There's a pause. I should grab my phone. I can sit down at the end of the night, sit on the couch, fold my hands in my lap, and just sit there for a minute and think. I don't have to reach for the remote and turn on TV or Netflix or what have you. And as I tell my listeners all the time, I'm as guilty of this as anyone. But the path to changing it is starts with recognizing that it is a thing, recognizing that it is something that exists, and then taking it a step further and saying it exists and I want to change it. And that's a leap sometimes. People may say, yeah, I probably watch too much TV. Yeah, I probably spend too much time on my phone. Yeah, I probably always have to have music on or a podcast or something because I just can't deal with the silence. That's fine. The next step is I want to change it. And then it's putting a plan into place and actually executing. That I think is the challenging part. But yeah, I mean, when I think back to, again, I keep going back as the names that are freshest in my mind, going back to, the Benjamin Franklins or the Frederick Douglasses or the George Washingtons or the Mark Twains or the whomever's, and imagining that a lot of the great thinking that they did was not interrupted by the same technologies that we have today. You hear people talking about long walks and being out in nature. I mean, John Muir talks about that all the time, about the most valuable growth a man can experience is when he is in nature, because it is the closest to his original self as he can achieve. Well, if that's the case, then all the pieces of technology that we have around us have only served to further remove us from our original selves. And if that's a deliberate choice in that I'm burnt out, I just want to watch some mindless television and pass some time, that's fine. But if it's the default, if it's the space filler, the time waster, and you don't have control over it, then I think there is something there to be at least examined and either accepted or rejected and changed.
You're making me think of Henry David Thoreau and Walden, and the idea of there is a maybe an unnatural and natural kind of musical background to life, right? So you talk about how when we talk about silence and wanting silence, of course, there's still the birds and nature. And Thoreau would say, Well, that is a kind of beautiful tranquility moment, right? We tend to, there's something built into us that goes back maybe evolutionary for a long time to kind of be able to have that in the background and still maintain concentration and thoughts, right? It's obviously, when ancestors were hunting and gathering, they had those sounds too, and they had to concentrate enough to be able to do the task at hand. So again, you're prompting me to think about something in a new way that I hadn't thought of before, which is this distinction between maybe an unnatural and natural silence, right? So the natural silence, the ability to sit on a bench in a park and reflect with birds and things like that, even human beings to a degree, kind of moving around a little bit in the background, you can attain a certain level of silence and meditation there, enough to be able to reflect on your life, on who you are, who you want to be, where you're going, all of those important aspects. And yet there is also a kind of unnatural sounds that comes from our modern day civilization, let's say, right? With the phones, with the ringings. How many times do we, when you hear a phone ring, even if it's a different ringer than what you have on your phone, you hear a phone ring and people just jump right for their pockets or whatever, because they're like, oh, is it me? I mean, when you think about that, what it's telling us, of course, is that we have been preconditioned at this point. We're actually conditioned, our bodies are conditioned to move, like Pavlov's dog almost, to these sounds, which means, and I'm going to go deep here and then get out quickly, but I mean, if you think about it, there is something that is maybe not horrifying is too strong of a word, but we have ceded a certain amount of our authority over our own bodies to the technology, which is fascinating to me. And I guess for me, maybe it's a little bit horrifying. I don't know if it is for anyone else, but I know I'm guilty of that. I'll hear a phone ring and I'll immediately think, oh, that must be me. Now, maybe there's a little bit of ego there too, existential ego, right? That somebody must be calling me. But that's not really the case. In actuality, I think it's more about that unnatural sound, and we're sort of becoming attuned to that. I was going to ask you about what you're consuming, what you're reading now that's actually you're interested in, and you mentioned is it One Square Inch of Silence?
That's correct. Yep. And
is that what you said?
And the authors, I think it's Gordon Hempton is the author of that particular book. And it's fascinating, and I appreciate you asking that question, because that's actually one of my favorite short little quips. You talked about knowledge is power. I mean, we could spend an entire podcast going down those 3 words. It sounds like you have in lecture with your students about what those 3 words mean. And one of my favorite little quips, and it comes from a Marine general retired, General Al Gray. He says, back in those days, meaning back in the day when he was younger, the first question you would ask someone is, what are you reading? And what a fascinating question to ask, right? And so that's why I say it's an interesting, it probably tells us more about a person based on their response to that question than how's the weather, how's your family, how's work, the usual small talk things. What are you reading is a really fascinating question. So yes, One Square Inch of Silence is on my list now. I recently finished a short course. It's basically a small history of the Marine Corps. It goes way back, but it really focuses on the period between World War I and World War II and through Korea and into Vietnam. And it's called First to Fight by General Krulak. And every Marine knows that book. We all read it. Probably the 3rd time I've read it. And I approached it differently now than I did 12 years ago when I read it, and 4 years before that or whenever I read it. And those things are interesting. I tend to, my general rule is I like to read something that I consider to be deliberately developmental in nature, something that is going to challenge me, something that I know going into is going to be, excuse me, going to be a challenge, something that I'm going to have to chew on. Whether that's a book of poetry or it is one of the tomes of yesteryear or recent. I mean, Steven Pinker's book Enlightenment Now is one that that book has an inescapable gravity to it that forces you to think. And there are many books like that. So I tend to waffle between books like that and then books that are deliberately escapist. whether they be fiction books or something that is just simply entertaining. One Square Inch of Silence is an interesting kind of mix of the two. I knew there would be things in there to think about, and I appreciate that it has changed my perspective towards the soundscape around me already. But it is also something that was meant to be. I just read a book about the Marine Corps, a book about the history of the Marine Corps, and all of that. I want to read something that's a little bit different, and now I have that. So, and there are probably 2 or 3 others that I'm partially reading. One's sitting on a Kindle somewhere that I pick up when I travel, and then there's a stack of books on my bedside table waiting to be read as well, which is pretty standard fare.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I've got kind of one more question here, a follow-up question. So I was talking earlier about something new that came out of a rereading for me. Was there something, I mean, in rereading this book now 3 times, this latest time, was there something that stood out to you that hadn't previously?
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned that. When First Fight popped into my head, I immediately went back to that question, and there was. General Krulak talks about how in the time after World War II, when there was a significant drawdown in budget and the military services were jockeying for the limited budget, and there was a lot of the book is about how the Army and the Navy wanted to absorb the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps almost had an existential crisis. And in order to address that crisis, the Marine Corps didn't turn to its most senior officers. It didn't turn to the commandant, and it didn't turn to the generals and the colonels. It turned to mid-career folks in the 10 to 15 year range. And they crafted, General Krulak among them, crafted many of the speeches and the draft legislation that eventually worked its way to the floor of Congress and eventually became codified into law in the National Security Act of 1947. And that's what, to this day, codifies the Marine Corps' existence. And that idea was interesting to me because I think, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the episode about Franklin and some others, is that the idea that they just had it figured out. That the Marine Corps' generals just expertly maneuvered themselves into a position where the Marine Corps could not be denied, and it continued to exist. And that's not the case. Ben Franklin on a boat at 20 years old writes the 13 Virtues that we talked about on the episode. General Krulak, then Major/Lieutenant Colonel Krulak, sat down and wrote legislation that worked its way into a National Security Act. And so the idea that we're waiting for something, we're waiting for some arrival of enlightenment, arrival of a critical mass of knowledge, experience, etc., before we can actually do something, is false. And that jumped off the page at me, and I went, there's no need to wait until I'm 50, 60 years old to write down my list of virtues. There's no need to wait until I'm 50 or 60 years old with 30 years of work experience to put down on paper what I think are good characteristics of a Marine or of an engineer or whatever. There's no reason to wait. And to your point, forcing yourself to go through the process of writing or saying aloud the things that you're thinking about really forces you to bring them into physical shape. Because I can't tell you the number of times where I've had a thought or I feel like I understand something, but then when I'm asked to explain it, I struggle. And it makes a certain amount of sense because, our thought processes don't always translate well into words. But one of my favorite exercises is to, when I identify a word that I feel like I know and understand, is try to describe that word, try to define that word. That's a very hard thing to do. A lot of what we know is in context. And if you can't actually put it out into words, there was a colonel that I used to work for who said, learn how to write so that your words can echo throughout history or throughout time. And I think there's a lot of value in that because it's one thing to think it, but if you think it and it never goes beyond that, then it dies with you. But putting it out into a medium like this conversation that we're having or putting something down on paper means that it's going to last. And it may not be until 200 years from now when somebody pulls out the speech or the document and reads what you wrote or said that it comes to mean something to beyond the end of our life. But that process, I think, is super important.
Wow. Matt, this was wonderful. Very thoughtful. Can you give us an indication where can people find you and find your work?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I have a website. It is quotationspod.com. People can find me there. You'll find all the episodes. You'll find a brief snippet about each episode, and also a nice little image of the quote. I try to mix them up, keep them interesting there. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. Folks can find me there, and I can be reached via email at quotationspod@gmail.com. So any search there for the Quotations Podcast should bring you to the website, Twitter, or Instagram, and I'd love to hear from any of your listeners there on any of their thoughts. I am nothing if not open to feedback. So.
Absolutely. And I'll have links as well in the episode notes too, to make it even easier so people can find you and find your work. And I encourage my listeners to go check these episodes out, because they added a lot of thoughtfulness to myself as well. And I appreciate that. I thank you for that myself.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It's been my pleasure to be a guest here, and I love the work that you're doing, and I hope that you continue to do so, because the deliberately listening to the things that you say has already yielded some things that I think will land themselves in the book. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for joining us. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Matt Munroe, and I encourage you to check out his podcast, Quotations, using the links I've provided in the show notes. And if you haven't yet done so, please hit the subscribe or follow button on the Neutral Ground podcast and leave a kind comment or rating where applicable. Every interaction that you make with the Neutral Ground podcast helps to bring our message of civility to human discourse in front of a new person. And as always, try to keep one foot firmly planted on the neutral ground. And have a great day. As the great Ben Franklin once said, put your phone away and look up. Yeah, he probably didn't say that, but he would have. I think he would have. Growing tired of all the extreme views that seem to do nothing but divide us as a people today? Well, believe it or not, you can actually do something about that with just a few keystrokes and a couple of clicks of the mouse. Start by hitting the subscribe button for the Neutral Ground podcast. Then, click the like button for this video. And leave a thoughtful or uplifting comment in the comment section below for others to engage with. And finally, consider watching another one of the videos up on the screen. You see, the more we engage the channel in clicks and keystrokes, the more we can get our Neutral Ground message in front of others. So, don't delay. Bring the Neutral Ground podcast to someone new today.